Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to grab a cup of tea, go and have a look at the dome. Don't go and look at it again. They're going to close the doors in a minute. You might get locked in. Definitely you'll get locked out. So for those of you who remember what I said before the break, please grab your pen and your piece of paper. For those of you who are online and are any good on Twitter, please can you take a little look at Inc 2040 Plym, that's INC 2040 capital PLYM, because they are tweeting and chatting and chattering and doing all the things that Twitter do. So if you can tweet and retweet on that, that would be absolutely brilliant. Got your pen and paper ready? Everybody? So it's my real pleasure to introduce to you now Matthew Finch. Now, Matthew helps companies, communities, and institutions to surface new ideas and bring them to action. And his work spans policy consultation, vision and strategic direction, community engagement, and professional development for staff at all levels. He's an Associate Fellow of Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. And this is a top tip for all of you. Get ready for an incredible and mind-expanding hour, because I've had the pleasure of listening to Matthew already. So I'll tell you now that your brain is in for a wonderful workout. So Matthew joins us virtually today. So hopefully we'll see him any second now. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Liz, and hello, everyone. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you in person, if only because I don't get the chance to sashay down that amazing staircase in the market hall at the start of this conversation. I'm in a weird position in terms of the sandwich we're making this afternoon, because I'm kind of one of the layers, probably not the cheese, probably not the onion, but part of the sandwich that is dealing with uncertainty. And we're going to talk a bit about things that haven't happened yet, things that might never happen, and how those can usefully inform the decisions that we face and the choices we have to make here and now. So my part over the next hour or so is to share some tools and offer you some ways of thinking about uncertainty that might usefully inform the conversations that you're having today and connect to the work of the other speakers. Just before we get fully underway, I also have to give an enormous thank you to Jerome and the AV team and all those people who, silent and unseen, are making this conversation possible today. And one of the other things I hope this talk does actually is to help things that were previously invisible to us become visible and present and part of the discussions we need to have about inclusion and growth in Plymouth and many other parts of the world. So uncertainty is a bit of a difficult one to get your teeth into, but of course, as for all of us as inhabitants of the 21st century, which has already contained the 9/11 attacks, the global financial crisis, the unexpected outcome of the Brexit referendum for many, the unexpected outcome of the 2016 US presidential election for many, the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're living in a century which seems very keen to teach us that the future will be capable of surprising us, of disrupting expectations, and in the immortal words of a strategist called Jed Davis, a trend is only a trend until it bends or it breaks. So figuring out which issues are sticky and persistent and stubborn and will endure into the future, and where there might be the potential for uncertainty and disruption is a big part of what we're going to be doing together over the next hour. And the image I have here before you is of a fleet returning to Plymouth Harbour in the 18th century. And I chose this image precisely to make the point that even when we are coming home, even when we think we are really in familiar territory, the possibility for disruption, for uncertainty is still great. So here you see these ships coming into the harbour, and they know the channel, there will be charts, they will have experience of coming home. But of course, what is happening beneath the waterline is always uncertain. In the skies above the fleet, you can see a mixture of light and dark, and the weather too can surprise us. Depending on the size and the condition of these vessels, it may be more or less easy to navigate whatever conditions present. And at all times, it's possible that there's something we've overlooked, even and especially when we seem to be in a really familiar situation. And the other thing to notice about this painting, which is from the archives of the National Maritime Museum, is there are people on the shore as well. And what you might reflect on is that for every single person in this painting, they have a different perspective and a different point of view on what's going on. And those different perspectives might highlight the blind spots of one another. So in fact, when we're gathered like this to have a conversation, it's a real opportunity to make use of the fact that no two of us stand in the exact same place. And we don't even necessarily have to agree on our analysis of what's going on in order to have a richer and wiser conversation about what we need to do today. The National Maritime Museum, which I just mentioned, happens to be 15 minutes down the road from where I live. And you can see it here at the bottom of this hill in Greenwich Park, which is one of the royal parks in London. Here's a lovely summer's day for a few years ago. People are sitting there having a picnic, enjoying the vista. And on a bench on the top of one of these hills in Greenwich Park, there's a poem written into the bench. It's not a great work of literature, in all honesty, but it's useful for our purposes. So I've put it on the top of this slide. And it says, "Here, fair Eliza, Virgin Queen, from business free enjoyed the scene. Here oft in pensive mood she stood, and kindly planned for Britain's good." So the idea is that Queen Elizabeth I would step away from day-to-day business, go up on the hill and get a fresh perspective. She'd enjoy surveying that landscape, but she'd still be pensive, she'd still be thinking, and she would kindly plan for the good of the nation that was in her care. And something similar is going to happen for us in this session, I hope. Maybe none of us are going to wear a crown or sit on a throne, but together we're going to step away from the pressures of the day-to-day, go up to get a fresh perspective on what's going on, and hopefully enjoy that as an imaginative experience. But we'll still be pensive, we'll still be thinking quite seriously about what's going on. And we'll be definitely thinking not about strategy just as competition, just as what it means to steer one ship or a fleet, but actually kindly planning for the good of the whole community we're concerned with, for the good of Plymouth, and in terms of that perspective of inclusive growth looking into the future. So as Alexis already kindly pointed out, this is a session where you're going to do a bit of writing. So I suggest you have a piece or two of paper close to hand, 2 or 3 in fact. And whether you're in the market hall right now or online, this is just a moment for you to grab something to write with and something to make a mark on. Back of a napkin is even fine. You're not going to be expected to share what you draw or write. This isn't an art class, this isn't a test, but it's just a way of getting ideas out of your head onto the page where you can reflect on them and work with them. And although I'm talking at you a bit up front here, the truth is, I believe, if you've got 70 to 100 people in person and online, one use of the time is for one person to speak and 99 people to listen. But the other possibility is that all 100 brains can be trained on the issues that matter, and we can all work on analysing and addressing the issues that we need to reflect on. So this is just a moment to have that paper to hand and to understand I won't be preaching at you so much as giving you an opportunity to work on some of these issues. And that's because the truth is, I don't have one of these, no one does. A magic crystal ball that tells you for sure what the future will hold. It simply doesn't exist. You can't even gather one data point, one shred of evidence from events which haven't happened yet. Anytime we make a forecast or a prediction, or we say this is how things are going to be, even if we assign a percentage or a probability to that, the truth is we're expressing confidence in our own predictive model based on what's gone before. We're trying to figure out which bits of yesterday might tell us about tomorrow, but no one has this magic crystal ball that tells us for sure what the future will hold. But that doesn't mean that a tool like this has no use at all, because even if the crystal ball is never going to give you an answer, the questions you ask it are still revealing. They tell us something about our concerns, our hopes, our fears, and our expectations. So the first thing I would like you to do is just reflecting on the situation in Plymouth, on the issues in your own organization or community, on the things you've already heard today. If you could pose just one question to a crystal ball, knowing you would definitely get a true answer about what the future held, what would you ask? I'm going to give you 1 minute to think about that. And it might be that a question immediately leapt to mind, but dig a bit deeper, question yourself, be more curious. You've only got one question to ask. How are you going to frame it? Is it a yes/no question? Is it an open question? Is it about a particular issue, or is it more broad? Is it a question that could be answered in a month's time, or 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10? How far are you looking ahead? Just take a few more seconds and think, what's the one question you would ask that crystal ball? And then when you've got that clear, just right in the corner, somewhere in the corner of your piece of paper, just write down that crystal ball question. Put it somewhere so you can come back to it. Maybe you'll talk about it in the next coffee break. Find out what other people asked. See if you asked the same questions or something very different. But even this, the asking of the question, tells you something about the things you can see and the things you're not thinking about. An economist called Thomas Schelling had this great saying, it's very hard to get someone to think of something that hasn't occurred to them yet. And that's always the problem with the questions that we know to ask a crystal ball. But by the end of this hour, we might have some new questions. The other thing about this is not only do I not have a crystal ball, but I'm not in the science fiction business. If we're going to look at the future, that's to help us make decisions today. And a storied, very, very celebrated civil servant called Sir Geoffrey Vickers, who was the key civil servant during the Second World War, he said that wise decision-making boiled down to 3 things. What's going on? What does it mean for us? And what can we do about it? And the danger is we always go so quickly to that third question. We think, well, we need to act. How do we act? How do we make the world the way we want or need it to be? There's real bias towards doing something and towards thinking that we have the power to really make the world as we wish, even though, as I said, this century keeps teaching us that the universe is going to mess with our plans. But the thing is, those other 2 questions are equally important when it comes to wise decisions. Of course, we don't want to get caught up in analysis paralysis, but really understanding what's going on, really understanding what it means, and then thinking about what we can act on and how we can act on it. Those are all equal components of wise decision making. So the reason today we might go out to the future and get a fresh perspective is purely to help us answer these questions today. And the tool we're going to use for this is called scenario planning. And I've put quite an academic definition on this slide, but it's about as academic as things are going to get before we roll up our sleeves and get to work. The reason I've done this is because you'll have heard the word scenarios before. You know, the IPCC does climate change scenarios. If you look in the newspapers, they'll say, here are scenarios for how the Ukraine conflict might play out. People use this term in all kinds of different ways. Forecasts, wargaming, thinking about how things might play out. And really, it's one of those things where there are so many definitions competing. So I just wanted to share what we'll be doing today and where that's grounded in. And at Oxford, at the Saïd Business School, we put it like this. Scenarios are assessments of the future context, developed for a specific purpose, that contrast with the way the future context is currently being framed. But what that means is we think about the future that we might have to live in. We do that for a particular reason. There's a particular issue we need to address. There's a particular decision that we face. We're not in the visioning business. We're not in the science fiction business. And the other thing we do is we create scenarios that challenge our assumptions about what future we're going to live in. So they could be light, they could be dark, but they're definitely meant to challenge our expectations and make us think twice about what we think is coming. They're not predictions. They're not saying how we want the world to be. They're thinking about the future that we might have to live in for a particular reason, and they aim to unsettle our assumptions. So my hope is over this hour, you will think, oh, really? The future could go like that? That's actually baked into the process. And just to take you through a little example, I don't have a crystal ball, but I do have an onion. I don't know if that passes muster in the sandwich that we're making now, but we call this diagram an onion. And again, the technical explanation is you've got a little orange bubble there, an organization that faces an issue or a decision. And they want to use the future to think about wise decision making today. So the two phases of that are, you can see here that orange organization lives on a black island, the transactional environment. And that is everyone that they interact with, all of the actors and relationships that they can directly influence. So if you're a business, that might be your customers or your suppliers, it could be investors, could be regulators, could be the media if you have a PR division. But those are all the relationships with entities that coexist with you on your island. But beyond that is this big blue contextual sea of uncertainties that are out of your direct control. And that could be things like geopolitics, finance, global health, social values, demographics, technology. Stephen, I think, talked in his presentation about the missing million, the idea that 1 million have gone from the workforce, even though it was projected that they were going to be there. And that's such a good example of a contextual uncertainty playing out in the present. Because what happens is these forces in the sea of uncertainty can come ashore together and redraw the map of your island, changing the world you operate in and the decisions that you face. So an example of this would be, imagine being a taxi driver in New York in the early 2000s. And you know the island you live on. Taxis have been in New York for donkey's years, and they've always worked the same way. You've got customers, you stand on the street corner, they hold up their hand, you pull over and you take them where they want to go. And if they want to go to the airport, there's a fixed fare. There's tolls for the tunnels, the system's really straightforward. You buy your taxi license, which is called a medallion, from the city authorities. You probably rent your car, you have a garage you go to, you fill up your car at gas stations, you compete against other taxi drivers, but you also probably collaborate with them in a union. You know your little black island with all the interactions on it. But outside, in that blue sea of uncertainty, you've got technological change, changes to regulation, and changes to social values. And what happens is there's a tech change because smartphones arrive. There's a regulatory change because they deregulate the public transport market. And then there's a social change where suddenly people say, do you know what? I'm actually willing to let a stranger ride in my car with me for money. And then suddenly the tech, the regulation, and the changing social values come together, and you get Uber, you get ride sharing services, and your little island works completely differently from how you thought. And when you paid all that money for a New York taxi license, suddenly it might not be as good a bet as it was before. So that's just an example of how it works when we look at uncertainties and the way they affect our environment. In fact, I'm obviously thinking about the pandemic again. So what I want you to do now is take a piece of paper and put it landscape with the long sides at the top and bottom, and just draw an island like this. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It's not a map making exercise. It's not a geography lesson. But I want you to draw a big oval island, and in the middle of it, put your organization. And I don't mind what that means for you. If it's a company or an agency or a community, if it's a team within a larger organization, if it's part of local government, if it's a charity, it could be a family or a neighborhood even. But whichever entity you feel is you, maybe that you represent today, put them at the heart of the island. I'm just going to give you a few seconds more because you might want to choose who you're going to consider as yourself. But then when you've got it, this is what I'm going to get you to do. I'm going to get you to have a go at mapping that transactional environment. So on the island, I just want you to put every single entity that you interact with. So think now, when your organization goes about its business, tries to achieve its goals, every single client, partner, supplier, regulator, funder, collaborator, what are the relationships that are part of you conducting your operations, going about your business? I'm going to give you just 2 minutes. And probably the first few come very easily to you. And now you might have to dig a little deeper. Think who you might have overlooked. And just check, make sure you're not missing any blind spots. Do you have a relationship with the inland revenue? Who else do you pay tax to or rates to? I did this work with the business development agency in Finland once, and it was small to medium enterprises at the middle of the island, and they totally forgot that small businesses have landlords. So who else is missing from that island who's you have a direct relationship with, and they're part of your day-to-day operations going about your business? I'm going to give you a few seconds more. Because sometimes this alone can be quite surprising and enlightening for us. We did this for head teachers of Norwegian schools a few years ago. It took 45 minutes to get every relationship: students, teachers, unions, universities, school nurses, the media, city government, national government, different ministries. So just look and think, who have we missed? Who can I capture in just 2 minutes of mapping this environment? Maybe 1 or 2 more names. And that's about time. That's about 3.5 minutes. So hopefully you just got those first names of the actors who are living on your island. And you see, what we would do if we had a little more time, and it's something you could go away and think about, is you could explore the sea that is specific to that island. You could say, what uncertainties affect that environment, and how might they come ashore? How might they affect your ability to recruit or retrain staff? How might they affect your ability to prosper? The difference between the sea beyond your control and the island of direct relationships is where the interesting tensions are when it comes to uncertainty. But there's only so much you can do in an hour. And so rather than try and push through building a whole set of scenarios in that time, which is ambitious, even for us, I think, it's a bit like Blue Peter. Here's one I made earlier. So a project called Imagine has been running for about 5 years with 16 institutions across 13 countries, looking at the dynamics between regions and nations and central authorities across Europe. So this is a project that began before Brexit, that includes British institutions and has been looking at the different relationships and tensions between regions and national centres and international actors as well, from different perspectives. So they've been looking at the big C that every region inhabits, and as a result, looking at different ways that sea could come ashore, we've come up with 4 scenarios that tell us something about the future we might have to inhabit. And what I'm going to do is take you on a kind of whistle-stop tour of those 4 futures, just so you get a bit familiar with them. And then we're going to go round again and just think about what they might mean for that island you've just drawn. So here are the 4 futures: Silver Citadel, Green Guardian, Silicon Scaffold, and Patchwork Rainbow. And they're set actually in the year 2048, so even further than the name of this event. But that's fine, because it's like Queen Elizabeth going up the hill to get a fresh perspective. It just means we've gone even higher up. And the further out we go, the more we can see how the future could diverge and how things could challenge our expectations. So the first one is called Silver Citadel. And in this future, decision-making is really heavily centralized, and policy-making is massively augmented by artificial intelligence. So policy is really decided by the algorithm. This is 26 years from now. So there've been further developments. Governance is very, very automated, and the focus is on leveling out, in the sense of what is considered fair in terms of regional development is trying to make every region equally prosperous according to traditional economic metrics. So very centralized, very automated, and the focus is on making everywhere equally prosperous. The next scenario is called Green Guardian, and it's equally centralized, but this is a world where the climate crisis has been absolutely catastrophic. And in this world, just trying to keep people alive and thriving, just trying to keep the planet going takes priority. So this world is, again, very centralized. It's actually post-capitalist, which doesn't mean there's no businesses or no trading, but it means the age of shareholder capitalism is done. The age of consumerism is done, because people know that the absolute priority is keeping the planet alive. And that focus on sustainability is overriding. So in some ways, this is a very tough world, but it's also emblematic of some of the trade-offs we already saw through the pandemic, where governments had to make tough decisions about, do we make a move that might tank the economy, but actually it will keep people alive and it might stop the spread, for example, of the coronavirus. So the arithmetic that people do around those kind of decisions has shifted really heavily towards well-being, health, and sustainability, but only because it's so tough to exist in that future. The third scenario is called Silicon Scaffold. And in this one, it's much more regionalized. And actually, social and economic life takes place in virtual spaces. This is a world where we really do live in the metaverse, or different kinds of metaverse. And virtual networking is so good that it's not just me on a screen in the market hall and a bit of a Zoom call, but actually you can work with people in San Francisco or Beijing, and it's like you're all in the same room. But that changes the question of who the haves and the have-nots are. Different regions thrive or fail in different ways. And in this world, governments are much weaker and corporations are much stronger. So, you know, like with American employers, often your health insurance is tied to your employment. In the US, more and more aspects of our daily life and services are actually privatized. And it's as important who you work for and which corporation is dominant in your region. So this might be a world where you had Amazon Ipswich or Tesla Edinburgh, and actually the corporation and the local government were deeply entwined. And the fourth and final scenario just on this whistle-stop tour is called Patchwork Rainbow. And this again is very regionalized, but it's a world where actually different regions don't agree on fundamental values. They don't agree on whether we should trust science. They don't agree on questions of gender. You might have corners of this patchwork that seem very progressive and far out compared to today, where you have 5-person marriages, or maybe human rights for Siri and for software agents. And then you'd have other parts of the patchwork that seem very regressive or are trying to turn back to a past that never even really existed. But some of the tensions we see today, it's not just about vax versus anti-vax. It's not about leave versus remain. It's not about the fact that while Ireland legalizes abortion and marriage equality, Poland seems to be moving in the opposite direction. Those tensions are much more pronounced and they're much more localized. And if that seems far out, you only have to think of the states and places like Pennsylvania, where a city might be strongly democratic. And then as you cross to a new postcode to the suburbs or the rural areas, suddenly you're in very Trumpish territory where people don't even believe that the last presidential election was legitimate. So as a result, you have fragmented regions, you have really divergent cultural and social values, lots of mistrust. And that means that regions, in order to thrive, because the country isn't pulling together, they have to look overseas. They have to build new alliances internationally. And it's almost a world where you might expect a region like Plymouth to have a kind of foreign policy because they would need sponsors from overseas. So that's just a really short tour of 4 big, bold scenarios. But I think I've given you a sense of the strong flavors of each one. And as you look, you might say, that one's interesting. That one's plausible. I don't like that one much. I don't believe that one would happen. But that's the point of stretching our sense of what is possible and plausible in the future and trying to find where our blind spots are. So precisely the scenario that you might want to turn away from, precisely the one where you think, oh, that's a bit silly, or how would that work? That might be the one that you need to look at more carefully. So I've put them up here as a 4 for a moment, so you can just reflect on that and think, oh, okay, I'm curious about this one. I believe in that one. This one I'm not so sure about. But it's okay because they're all a set, all meant to stretch our expectations. And now I'm going to put you back to work because I've been talking for a bit. What I'm going to get you to do is take a fresh piece of paper, or if you find there's really very little piece of paper, you can turn it over. I want you just to divide that piece of paper into a grid, 4 quadrants, just like this, very swiftly. And I'm sure it will not surprise you in the slightest to know that what we're going to do is use each quadrant to think about one of those 4 scenarios. So I'll give you a moment to divide up that piece of paper into 4. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to think briefly about each scenario in 2048 and thinking about your island, what would have changed in that future? So I'm going to start off with Silver Citadel. In that top left quadrant, this is the one where it's very centralized, government by algorithm, and the focus is on leveling out economically. So every region is doing equally well according to the metrics. What would that mean for Plymouth if these questions of inclusion and growth were centrally defined, focused on strictly economic measures to the point of being automated? How would your island change in that future? Just take a minute or 2 now and just jot some thoughts in that top left corner. And take some time to look at your island and think, who would still be there 26 years from now in this kind of future? Who would still be there? Who would have gone? Would there be new people on that island? Who would be the winners and losers? What would your island be like in that future? Just a few seconds left to get 1 or 2 more dot points down. And then that's probably the last word or two you're going to write for Silver Citadel. So when you've got that down, I have to move you to a different future. And we're going to go to Green Guardian, very centralized, climate catastrophe, sustainability matters more than anything else. How would Plymouth fare in a future fully defined by the green agenda? Not just the Green New Deal, but absolutely going beyond that. A future where people don't even like the way we live now. They say, why were you driving around in cars polluting things? Didn't you see that the way you ran the economy was hurting the environment? If that was the future we were going to live in, what happens to your island? Who would be on it 25 years from now? And how would Plymouth be doing? If every single activity had to be regulated for environmental impact, what would that mean for your island? How would that be done? What would it mean for the work that you do? And if that rhetoric of people beyond profit, if the economy became about things like fair share, again, about environmental impact, what might that mean for the way things run on your island over the next 20 years? And once again, I have to move you on in a moment. So it's just a chance to jot a last word or two down. Something might come up by instinct, just by thinking your sort of knee-jerk reaction. Some of it might be more analytical or reasoned, but just your response. What would happen to my island in that future? And now I must move us on again, I'm afraid we're halfway. This next scenario is Silicon Scaffold. That's the one where we're living in the clouds, in digital spaces, and the work of local government is really done by the local corporation. The world, I think I said Amazon Ipswich and Tesla Edinburgh. What would that mean for Plymouth's fortunes to have a corporate sponsor in digital space? And given that you could co-work in virtual spaces with people from all around the world, as long as you had the right corporate alliances, what would be the possibilities of Plymouth as a virtual jurisdiction? And to me, this always seemed the most far out one. But think of Estonia, where they have e-citizenship residences. You can register for citizenship in Estonia today and set up a business there online. What would that mean for Plymouth if we go in that direction for 20 years or more? Who would be the haves and have-nots? If you couldn't get into the right virtual spaces, who would be the haves and have-nots if virtual life was almost more important than physical life? And can you already imagine who that corporate sponsor would be? Can you already see who the big private players are who would see Plymouth as a place worth planting their flag? And once again, we're coming to the end of this little moment of time. Just a few more seconds, thoughts, insights, something that just occurs to you that hadn't occurred before. Or maybe something you've really nutted out. Okay, this is what this means for my island. Someone would have gone, someone else would arrive. Last few seconds. And we have to move on one last time, I'm afraid. So the final scenario is called Patchwork Rainbow. And this is the one where no two regions agree, even on fundamental social values, even on questions of truth and belief in science and democracy, questions of gender, absolute fundamentals. Never mind vax versus anti-vax, never mind the culture wars. Things have become incredibly polarized on a local level. So what does that mean for the already complicated dynamics of the Southwest? How could changed identities and values affect the people and institutions of Plymouth in times to come? Can you imagine what kind of region Plymouth would be in that kind of patchwork of values? And what would all that mean for the island that you drew? Just a little bit longer. And again, this one seemed very wild to me when we first came up with it, but it reminds me of Trump's US. It reminds me of postcode lotteries. It reminds me of this increasingly fractured or fragmented civil discourse we have. How might that look if it just kept on playing out and intensifying at the most local level? Last few seconds. Maybe just a word or two more in that bottom right-hand quadrant of your piece of paper. And then I'm going to let you rest your pen hands for a moment. Hopefully it's not quite so much that you need an ice bucket, but that was 8 good minutes of writing and thinking, so I thank you for that. I'm going to put all 4 scenarios back on the screen for a moment, because each one of these is meant to stretch thinking in a different direction. They're not predictions, so it's not about how likely they are. They're not desired states, because it's not about whether they're good or bad, because each one of these is like the world we're in today. It's only good or bad depending on where you stand in it. But each one of them provides a stretch. And even though they're set far out in 2048, that stretch is often about something that's much closer to home than you think. So I'm going to talk for a moment to give you some processing time before we bring these scenarios back to Plymouth in the present day to think about wise decision making. And the example I wanted to give came from 2019 when we did the first version of these scenarios, and we were using them with very big European institutions. And in Silver Citadel, that one in the top left-hand corner, where everything's centralized, everything's automated, this big, strong economic bloc. We said, you know, in 2048, in that scenario, Ukraine is probably part of the EU, and Russia probably wouldn't like that. And there's probably an ongoing, bitter, probably slightly low-level war between Ukraine and Russia, between the EU and Russia on that eastern border. And at the time, people laughed. They said, you're doing scenarios about regional development and dynamics. Why is there a war in them? Where's this come from? It's pretty far-fetched. And it's not that we predicted what would come to pass within 2 or 3 years. It's that we'd correctly brought to the surface one of those dynamics that had been hidden, one of those things that were outside of the frame of reference, one of those things that people didn't know they needed to ask the crystal ball. So when you look at this set and think about the conversation we've just been through, that is also about stretching our sense of what the future can hold and admitting that sometimes it's the most uncomfortable corner that is the one that we need to pay most attention to, because it's probably the place that we don't like to look. But as I said all along, we're not in the science fiction business. It's not about magic crystal balls. I want to wind back now from those 4 futures to the implications the scenarios hold for choices today. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, you can take some notes if you want to. It can be a moment of silent reflection. I always think it's good to get your thoughts down on the page if you've got somewhere to write. But I want you to think about that journey you've been on, the island and the 4 quadrants. And just think for each of those 4 futures, if that scenario was ahead of us, if it was definitely one of those 4, what activities should we start, stop, or continue? Given that our island would change, what new conversations should we be having, and with whom? I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to ponder that one. And so you might think for each corner, when I say start, stop, continue, no one ever wants to stop doing anything good. Everyone always thinks, oh, we'll stop that thing because we don't like it anyway, or because it's rubbish. But real strategy is admitting that you have to stop something that is otherwise good because it's not going to serve you in the future you're heading towards. So with that first question, when you look at those 4 scenarios, what otherwise good, worthwhile, useful thing would you surrender, sacrifice, or ease off on if you knew we were heading to one of those 4 scenarios? If you knew Plymouth was going to change in that way, what good thing would you stop to make space for something that was more important in your judgment? And the other thing to reflect on is about those new conversations. So we did some work with an Australian insurance company a couple of years ago, and they said, we do travel insurance and home insurance, we're never going to do health. So we showed them scenarios for the year 2070, which is pretty far out. But we did that because that far out, you could see that smart homes would probably have medical technology in them. And at least in one scenario, in one future, your home might do some of the work of your GP. And then once we took them that far out, we looked around in the present and we saw places where you're wearing a Fitbit on your wrist and it does integrate into your smart home technology. We saw that in the homes of high net worth individuals, that there was already medical technology built into the home. And so then we said to this insurance company, are you sure? Are you sure you don't even need to go and talk to a health tech startup? Are you sure that the presence of Fitbit and Alexa and all of those things isn't going to mean that one day health insurance and home insurance are totally entwined. So I'm just going to give you a moment more to think, what new conversations should you be having if one of those four scenarios was coming to pass? It might be a really unlikely one, but who should you start talking to today if you knew that that was what tomorrow was going to hold? And that's just about time. If you want to take a note or two more, I'll give you a last few seconds. But this isn't even really about what happens in 2 minutes or 1 hour or one afternoon. It's about the ways in which this stretches our thinking or it sparks something new. It's about the bit of this talk and the whole day that you remember on the drive home, or tomorrow morning when someone asks, how was that event? Or next week or next month. The point is the stretch to say more things are possible than we expected, because we know this century is full of turbulence and uncertainty and surprises. So we don't change the world in 60 minutes. We don't even necessarily have some kind of Buddha-like moment of enlightenment because we saw scenarios and some guy was on a big screen in the market hall. But that stretch just means we can think differently and maybe see some of the blind spots that aren't evident when we only go by what we can already see around us and the data and evidence we can only gather from the past. I have to thank you enormously, because this session has really depended a lot on our relationship, your trust in me and my faith in you. But my hope is it's given you thinking time beyond just having someone give you a lecture about the future and pretending that he has a crystal ball for 60 minutes. And I wanted to end with a Plymouth specific story, which is from history, but also from now, because I was thinking about this ship called the HMS Surprise, which is the ship in the Master and Commander novels, the Aubrey Maturin novels written by Patrick O'Brian. Great historical novels set in the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And the ship in those novels that the heroes sail in is called the Surprise, at least for some of the books. And it was based on a real ship. And the interesting thing about this ship was it was actually originally a French frigate called the Unité. So the French built it, sent it out to war. The British captured it, took it to Plymouth, refit it, renamed it, and sent it back to fight against the people who created it. And when the war ended, it was sold and turned into scrap. But then centuries later, this historical novelist said, oh, I could use that ship in my novels. And then later on, when those novels became successful, the ship that you see in this photograph turned up, which is a replica of another ship. This replica is called the HMS Rose. But O'Brien saw the HMS Rose at an event and he said, if you painted that differently, that could be the Surprise, that could be the ship from my novels. So they did that. And as a result, he said, you know what, I can now imagine you making a movie of this. I hadn't allowed that before, but now he gave permission for them to make a movie. And that movie was Master and Commander, which came out in 2003 with Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany. And so centuries after the original war, the idea of that ship was still making money for Hollywood, creating value for audiences in a way that had nothing to do with fighting at sea. So when we think about strategy, it's not just about steering our ship or steering even a fleet collectively. It's not just about the sea that we move through. It's about what everything means. And in a compressed way, that journey that took centuries of a ship going to war, changing sides, then coming back in fiction, then coming back in movies, then making money globally, those are the kind of twists and turns we have to be prepared for. Twists and turns of meaning, as well as just facing a choice based on what we can already see around us today. So what I hope is that this session has stretched and challenged a little bit and shown that whatever we think we've got today, it could be turned against us, it could be turned into something else entirely, but that actually, if we look ahead and stretch our imaginations, we can make wiser decisions. And I'm very pleased to have had this time with you. If you have any comments or questions, you can get in touch. I'm sure the organisers will pass on contact details. And I've tried to stay within time because we've started a little late. On that note, I must hand over to Alexis, and I'm very, very grateful to you all. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I hope you can hear the applause where you are. Well, I'm sure that your minds have been blown, as have mine. I've had the pleasure of listening to Matthew before, and I have to tell you that I get stuck on those 4 islands. I'll definitely be thinking about them as I drive home. Also, I'll just share with you that somehow in my brain, Alexa and the fridge and a doctor all become one thing. So that's just me, but I'm sure that you'll all be doing all of this. It's a really fascinating way of spending an hour and projecting the future individually and collectively. So that's obviously given us a lot to think about, and I'm going to give you the opportunity now to have a little bit of brain rest for a few minutes, another cup of tea and a break. And when you come back, we'll be hearing from Fiona Tuck and taking part in a facilitated session. Thank you very much, everyone.